Hi, I'm Kevin Cummins. I'm going to take you through my expectation for this week's FOMC meeting. The Fed meets on Tuesday and Wednesday this week. On Wednesday, the market is looking for the FOMC statement at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then, of course, what typically happens after an FOMC meeting, the Federal Reserve Chair Powell will address the media at 2:30. There's not too much to expect from the FOMC this week. I think from the standpoint of many changes to the statement, there probably aren't going to be all that many. The wording on the economy can largely be repeated from the last statement in December, although officials will probably note some of the signs of slowing in the overall economy since the December meeting. If you remember earlier this month, we had a very weak jobs report. It showed an outright in job growth. Jobless claims have started to pick back up heading into year end, consistent with the idea that tighter restrictions regarding COVID are leading to a slowing in the overall economy. We've seen retail sales fall for 3 straight months, and it seems that consumer confidence has been cracking a little bit here in early 2021. So that the Fed is probably in the near term a little bit more concerned than they were in December, but not probably meaningful enough to really change the overall tone of the statement. I think the overall message from the Fed will continue to be very dovish. Powell will begin his press conference at 2:30. Presumably, he'll reiterate that there'll be, significant near-term challenges and uncertainties associated with COVID. But that news on the vaccines remains fairly encouraging for the outlook. I think he's going to very much repeat that the outlook for the economy is very much dependent on the course of the virus. This is something that he's really emphasized correctly since last spring. But I think that he will sound a little bit more concerned with regard to the labor market and the near-term economy. Just because of renewed restrictions and lockdowns and some of the social distancing that people are continuing to live their lives with COVID for the time being. But that the Fed's outlook eventually is going to get better, as most economists are forecasting, as vaccines start to be more widespread, the economy should start to come back. So I think, from a medium to longer term, I think Powell's going to be a little bit more optimistic than certainly the near term. And don't forget, the meeting in December was prior to the phase 4 fiscal stimulus package that I would imagine he'd say that, because at least due in part to this, that we're going to get through the next couple of months because of, still accommodative monetary policy, as well as the latest round of fiscal policy. I would think that the press does ask for his insights about the Biden's proposal, President Biden's proposal about additional round of fiscal stimulus of a $1.9 trillion fifth round of stimulus. But I think Powell will probably, emphasize that that's, up to fiscal policymakers and not so much the Federal Reserve Chair, but that the economy is still in a very vulnerable position. So any additional fiscal stimulus would be helpful to get the economy back on track, will be the takeaway. But I think in general, he'll avoid any specific targeted ways of approaching a potential fiscal stimulus package that is likely in the next couple of months. He'll be asked on inflation from the standpoint of break-even market-based inflation expectations have drifted back up since the committee met in December. But the overall backdrop for the actual inflation has been very weak. If you look at the trend in core inflation, the latest CPI last week put the year-on-year pace at just 1.6%. And prior to COVID, that was running at 2.4%. Earlier this month, on January 14th, the chairman was asked in a pretty extensive Q&A about his view on inflation, and he sounded very dovish. He said if inflation were to go up for any reason, it's unlikely to stay up. There's plenty of slack in the current economy, and he doesn't feel that there's wage pressures going to push inflation higher anytime soon that would support higher inflation. So, he emphasized that the economy is still a long way away from maximum employment. So I suppose that his overall view hasn't changed very much since January 14th. If anything, the core CPI was a little on the softer than expected side. Meanwhile, with regard to interest rate policy or balance sheet policy, unlike the December meeting, where really market participants were very much focused on whether or not the Fed was going to try and provide more accommodation in the time being in December, and they opted out not to, other than just kind of aligning their language specifically with regard to their balance sheet to their longer term strategy. They left the weighted average maturity steady. And we had thought they would leave it steady. Some in the market were expecting a change in this. But I think since then, Powell's, and even at the press conference there, he was pretty clear that, if circumstances were to shift, then additional action could be warranted. But, he raised some doubts on the effectiveness about trying to change around their purchases. And he kind of suggested that unless financial conditions were to change and to tighten, then right now, the amount of support that monetary policymakers are providing is certainly, in his view, appropriate. So we're not looking for any changes this time around, nor is the market. In fact, I think that sort of take on whether or not there's going to be a future maturity extension leaves the Fed kind of in the case of, if things were to worsen and get bad, they have additional tools there that they could use that tool. But right now, it doesn't seem like it's going to be unveiled anytime soon, unless, again, we see some sort of tightening in financial conditions that they feel the need to try and offset that. We'll also expect that the chairman, there's been a lot of rhetoric more recently about the potential timing of tapering of the QE program. The December minutes that were released in early January more touched on just the fact that there was a conversation about the overall QE program. I don't think it was necessarily a signal from the Fed of any sort of near-term hawkishness. Let's not forget, the Fed right now is most concerned about making sure that the recovery eventually gets back on track. So they're clearly in the mode of the dovish camp, and their, I think, bias is to doing more and not less, or taking back any sort of a policy accommodation that's in the system right now. So I think that Powell will probably continue to signal that the economy is far from their goals, and that they're strongly committed to using the tools, and that they're not considering tapering their asset purchase program anytime soon. We at NatWest Markets don't believe that this is something that they're going to do at all this year. It's probably not until 2022 before they can feel comfortable enough that inflation has moved back up to the range what they feel is satisfactory. Clearly the risk, listening to Powell, from their perspective, is the downside risk to inflation, and they're trying to thread the needle here by this new average inflation targeting backdrop that they're following, that they're trying to really be confident that the economy is back on track, that inflation is back close to and allowing it temporarily to go over their medium 2% target, that they'll want to see that before they start removing accommodation. So, I think he'll very much back away from any talk about tapering this year, and that the Fed is very still much focused on making sure that the recovery takes hold. Meanwhile, we'll get every year there's the voting members of the FOMC shift around a bit from a regional presidential standpoint. So we'll get this year, there'll be four new voters and rotating on, and there'll be four voters from last year that won't have a vote at this year's meetings. The four regional bank presidents who rotate onto the FOMC this year are Richmond Fed President Barkin, Atlanta Fed President Bostic, Chicago Fed President Evans, and San Francisco Fed President Daly. Then the four who are rotating off are Dallas Fed President Kaplan, Philly Fed President Harker, Minneapolis Fed President Kashkari, and of course, Cleveland Fed President Mester. It doesn't really change the composition. I think, the overall rhetoric this year is likely to remain very dovish, given that the outlook is still highly uncertain, and it'll very much depend on how the path of COVID takes place. That, sometimes you could see a rotation amongst bank presidents as having an impact on the voting. But I think this year, like their dot plot in December showed, the Fed is not going to be anxious to get rates back up for several years. Through their forecast of 2023, they have no rate hikes penciled in, nor do we, and we don't think it's likely, probably for even a couple of years after that. So I think the overall message is going to remain very dovish this week, but not really expecting all that many changes to the statement or to the overall tone from Fed Chair Powell.